recording. So
Too late.
I'll go ahead and do a quick introduction of myself. So my name is Azim Manjee. I'm a cloud solution architect at Microsoft, focused on a lot of the boring stuff, servers and networking. But sometimes that lands with VDI and cool things like governance in Azure and a lot of those kinds of fun technologies. And so that's kind of me in a nutshell. I'm based out of Atlanta. I used to work at the Coca-Cola company, and sometimes I do some of these presentations. I'll hand it over to Rob, who's our global black belt. So he's the real star.
Yeah, hey, good evening, Rob Shaw. I guess my role is GBB on the WVD team, which what I interpret that to mean is VDI on Azure. So we help customers get to Azure with different VDI tools, whether it's native VDI with WVD or whether it's Citrix or VMware. I've been in the VDI space for some time, Citrix, Dell partners, as well as a law firm or two. But also in the Atlanta area, live in the Cumming geography. So pleasure to meet you all.
Yeah. So Rob, do you want to kind of go into maybe what is WVD? I'll pull up the architecture here, and you can kind of maybe explain for quickly, like what is WVD and why would someone want it?
I have no idea. I'm supposed to know. So I guess what I jokingly like to say is I like to call it a brand new 20-year-old product, right? And by that it's brand new in that it's something new, but it's based on an architecture that started 20 years ago, which was an acquisition of some technology from a company that we've all heard of, Citrix. And being able to leverage a technology that we could then build on top of. And that was started out as Terminal Server Edition. It's become then Terminal Server RDS, RDSH, Session Host, RDMI. And now, today we've kind of rebranded that to call that, WVD, right? And, at the core, what it really is we're taking that capability, that terminal server capability, and getting rid of all of the background stuff that it takes to build and offering it as a PaaS offering, right? So that at its core becomes key. And the architecture slide that you see up in front of you, kind of, spells it out. And if you've ever built out a Citrix environment, a VMware VDI environment, or whether you've built out native terminal server, that there's a lot of pieces. You have web servers, you have a SQL database, you have brokers, gateways. Then if you want to monitor and management of that environment, there's a lot of pieces. So we've taken all of the back-end stuff, thrown it to the side, and provide that as a full service offering. So when you look at this top section, the web access diagnostics, gateway, load balancing, broker management, all of that is managed by Microsoft, and it's facilitated. You don't have to do anything. So you get to focus on the things that are important to you, your images and your users and what you're delivering out to them. So at its core, in a matter of, well, to say minutes might be, a little bit fast, but instead of 6 months to deploy this architecture, waiting on servers, deploying OSs, this could and does happen in minutes to hours.
Yeah, I mean, I deployed one
versus
this morning for a Fortune 500 in an hour.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And yeah, so no red tape, no nothing. We just went through. So sorry to interrupt you. I apologize.
Oh no, that's exactly what it's about. Is being able to simplify that which was a very difficult architecture to deploy. Sorry about working from home. One of the conditions of COVID. For a Chihuahua, he can make a really loud sound. So at its core, WVD is not just terminal server offered as a PaaS. It's something different in that in the early days of VDI, you either deliver a virtual desktop or you do terminal server. And if you do terminal server, you reskin that OS to look like a desktop. One of the really key things that we've done here with WVD is be able to take that that what would otherwise be, say, a server operating system that you reskin to look like a desktop, and we've kind of changed that model to where Now I can take a Windows 10 machine and I can make it multi-user aware, right? We call Windows 10 multi-user. So no longer do you have to reskin a terminal server operating system to get that desktop experience. So I think that's one of the key things that a lot of folks, really like about, the delivery of what we have today is that they don't have to reskin it. And it's kind of, I don't have to decide between VDI or between terminal server. I can do both, right? And at its core, what we're delivering is really both published apps, published desktops, and actual virtual desktops, depending on what you're wanting to get to. Other things that we do, there's a licensing advantage in that I don't have to have a terminal server license to be able to use it. I can consume it by way of my Windows 10 M365 agreement and be able to then just pay the difference in really Azure consumption. Another thing that we're going to talk about later is to be able to make that more personal, make it more customizable for a user, and that's leveraging a technology called FS Logic. So we're going to talk about that a little bit later. So in a nutshell, that's kind of the high level of what WVD is. I'm sure you have 50 things, Azim, you would add to that.
Yeah, I mean, the main thing that I like my customers to know is the things you care about, you have to manage. So the desktops themselves, all the other things Microsoft manages, and you sort of de-risk it. So the way I think of it is the stuff that you have to protect. Like when you run your own VDI, you've got to poke holes in your firewall. You've got to, have an attack surface out there. So all of that stuff Microsoft manages in this new environment, and so you're sort of de-risking it. So when someone DDoSes the front door for Windows Virtual Desktop or the traffic manager instance that it lives in, so that entry point, you don't have to worry about that. Microsoft has to deal with that. And so, no more poking holes in the firewall, no more having to get certificates. All the stuff that you hated when you managed RDS is now de-risked. So that's the main thing that I usually tell people. So we'll go ahead and I think from that perspective, we'll kind of say, why are you all here, right? So I know why you're all here. You all want to go fast, right? And so that's why we're doing the 0 to here in an hour. We want to go fast, but the key thing about going fast is you want to be efficient. And so the thing that I like to really impress upon people is that, you're going to want to, spend the time to maybe read the documentation just a little bit, but I'm going to give you the main key things that you need to know in terms of prerequisites and gotchas. So, this is a joke that I like to post up, right? Remember, a few hours of trial and error can save you several minutes of looking at some documentation, right? So I like to just kind of, it's always fun to learn and do some trial and error. And at the end of the day, that's a great way to learn, right? Is to fail fast, but the key is to be fast. So I got some hot links here that I want you all to sort of, keep in mind. These links are the key sort of, AKMS links to cover all of it. And so the main ones I just created this week are the AK.ms/WVD prerequisites and WVD requirements. That really covers, in a nutshell, what you're going to need to have in place. But I'll tell you right now, the main things that you need to have in place are, first, you need to have an Azure virtual network, right, for these machines to land in. Windows Virtual Desktop only runs in Azure, so you need an Azure virtual network. And in that virtual network, you need to be able to reach your domain controllers. So you need to be able to domain join machines. And when I ping domain.local or whatever my domain is, I need a response, which means I need to have my DNS set up as such that I can either reach a domain controller locally within Azure or through a VPN or express route to my on-premise environment where my DCs maybe live. Another workaround, if you don't want to spin up a bunch of DCs and stuff in Azure, is Azure AD Domain Services, right? So if you've got an Azure AD environment and you're fully cloud and you don't even have a domain on-prem or something, you can create Azure AD Domain Services for like $120 a month, and it's a managed domain that synchronizes your users from Azure AD into a managed domain that you don't have to manage or anything like that. Microsoft deals with the management, and then you can domain join devices in that fashion. So those are the two main things. If you're doing firewalls and stuff like that in Azure and really controlling traffic, the requirements section has a safe links URL that'll tell you all the things that you need to whitelist in your network. So if you're following that, amazing zero trust approach, that's something that I've seen as a gotcha. So the two main things that I see fail in a Windows Virtual Desktop environment are going to be that domain join and possibly, installing the agent from the machine to essentially deliver that broker service, from the architecture diagram, right? So we use an agent to deliver this whole top section. And so there needs to be the allowed traffic from that perspective. So just some of those things. These other links, the akms.fs logics, that's really to cover some of the documentation around profile redirection. So the idea is if you have many of these servers, a user could land on any one of them, but we want their experience to be consistent, right? We want to make sure users have an awesome experience. And so FS Logics helps facilitate, the redirection of their profile so that if they land in machine A today, they'll have their profile, and then if they land in a machine B the next day, their profile redirects to that machine. The way that works is you need some kind of backend storage on Samba, a Samba share, something like that, or SMB as people refer to it, SIFs, I think sometimes they call it, whack whack server name, blah, blah, blah. In that case, you would need some kind of storage, right? And then FS Logics will create VHDs for your users automatically with some reg keys. And so not to get too far ahead of myself, but we're going to go ahead and build a host pool, if that's all right. Does that sound good, Rob?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that really hits it. And I think another thing to mention is when you go into the WVD requirements, you'll see what the licensing requirements relative to WVD are. And what you'll see is most likely for most customers, you already have what it takes to run it. So there's no session host requirement. You probably already have it with your Windows 10 licensing.
Yeah. So in my environment, I've got, this is my WVD instance, and this is actually the old non-ARM version. There is an ARM version, so we're going to actually show you how to build it in ARM, but this is what that user interface looks like. So I'm delivering not only applications, but full desktops. So I can deliver, a straight up Windows 10 environment, right? It looks like Windows 10, but many users. So the economics are really awesome because you can do kind of a many to one. And from that environment, I can sign in with my on-prem AD credentials and deliver a desktop. Now, I love to show the web client. We also have what's called the FAT client as well. This is a client that you can push out to your, desktop machines that are running Windows 10. We also have the Mac client. We have an Android client, and we have an iOS client. But ultimately, I've got a Windows 10 machine in the cloud that I can use that's attached into my network, and I don't have to VPN to get to it. So I can actually allow myself to get into a machine without having to extend layer 4 networking to individuals out in the field, right? So from a security perspective, it's very valuable because now I'm not opening up my network to machines that are out in the wild, and that's really huge these days. So I've been finding a lot more customers are really valuing that, and so these machines are burstable machines, but we're going to go ahead and get into building because I know that's why you were all here, right? Who wants to see something built, right?
So can we see some more PowerPoint slides?
Yeah, I know, right?
And I think to add on to what you were saying, what I'm hearing again and again and again is customers saying, "I want to get rid of my VPNs."
Yep.
So not that VPNs are a bad thing. It's that VPN just gives you access. It doesn't deliver apps. It doesn't deliver. It just gives you secure access. So, I think being able to give access and security all in one time, I think that's what we hear again and again from customers that are jumping on board with moving their VDI to Azure.
Bingo. Yep. And one of the things I hear a lot of my customers saying is, I want to have VPN, but I don't want to give everybody VPN. VPN is costly and risky, right? It's good for secure access, but it can also be a security risk. So providing them with a desktop, forcing them to MFA to get into that desktop, those sorts of things, that's how we can sort of secure this. So I hope this is zoomed in enough to kind of make it, visible for everyone. I want to make sure I'm describing this in the proper way. So I've gone into the Azure portal and I just searched the top bar for Windows Virtual Desktop, right? And now I'm sort of at this landing page where I can create a host pool. And as long as you've got an Azure Virtual Network that can allow machines to domain join, you can go ahead and move forward to create a host pool. And it basically gives me an ARM template. So I'm going to pick my subscription where my host pools usually land. So it's my WVD subscription. And I'll go ahead and throw this into what I'm going to call this. I'm just going to call this Trash Me RG because I'm going to throw this away once I'm done. I'm going to call this host pool the WVD Trash Me. And one of the main things about this host pool name and some of these machine names is there's some limits. So the ARM template will tell you if you're doing something you're not supposed to be doing. In terms of location, this is where the metadata for the users and stuff live. These are the available regions today. We are expanding this, but if you're in a situation where you've got regulatory data residency that you need to adhere to, we can kind of talk further about that. Feel free to ping me. aka.ms/Azure Azim. If you want to, if you want to ping me about this, happy to talk a little bit more. I'm going to go with East US because that's where I'm located, and I want to make sure I've got my latency. And then in terms of host pool type, there's two kinds, right? There's personal, which is just like the old VDI, right? If you wanted to deliver Windows 10 as VDI, it's 1-to-1, right? So one person per machine. The use cases for that are really great if you're doing like non-Teams voice and video. So if you're doing like Avaya or Jabber or something, those older kind of voice applications, they really don't like sharing machines. And then developers. So, everyone's like developers, developers, developers. I know it's a joke from the old Bomber days, but if you have software developers who need VDI, typically they will kind of rub elbows with each other too much, and developers tend to not share instances very well unless they're just doing some kind of basic like
And I think
integration testing or something.
And I think also a lot of times those developers need admin rights to be able to install their own apps. And a lot of times what I get from customers is, where we call it personal. Most of the VDI world would call that persistent. So at Microsoft and WVD world, it's a personal assignment instead of a pooled assignment. So you can take that to mean a couple different things depending on how you look at it.
Yeah. And so, we try to make this as personal as possible for our users. But at the end of the day, the economics are on the pooled side. So if you're trying to get the most as you can out of Azure, which I always recommend, I want you to squeeze blood from a stone when it comes to Azure. If you're not optimizing, you're doing it wrong on Azure. You should be getting every bit of value out of those compute cycles and memory cycles and disk storage amounts. So that's kind of how I view things. Salespeople aren't really happy with the way I talk about it, but that's just the reality. If we aren't optimizing, our competitors will. So that I firmly believe in you optimizing on Azure, and you should not be wasting, because if you're wasting, it means that's money you're not going to get value out of later. And so that's kind of how I see it, but that's my philosophy. In terms of the load balancing, I like to explain this as well a little bit, just real quickly. So breadth first means if I've got many machines, it's going to land people on each machine before it puts a second person on a second machine. So, it spreads everyone out sort of horizontally. Depth first means if I've got many machines, it's going to fill one of my machines first before it starts putting someone in the next machine. So that's kind of how we approach it. I typically would go with breadth first so that people have as much room as they can before they start having to share resources. From here, we'll go ahead and go on to the virtual machines. And so you can create a host pool without adding VMs, but I almost always add VMs. But sometimes, there's a need where you might not have to, where you might want to create a host pool without actually putting some VMs in. In this case, I'm going to go with a very cheap virtual machine, but really on the Windows Virtual Desktop part, the only thing you pay for on the Azure side is the VMs. So this is where it's really cool. I've got customers running RDSH or RDS and different other VDI platforms in Azure, and they're paying for the session brokers, they're paying for certificates, they're paying for the firewall, they're paying for all these different things. But when you're on the WVD space, you only pay for the VMs that are host pool, part of the hosts. So you could save a lot of money because there's a lot of ancillary infrastructure that you don't need to purchase. So I'm going to go ahead and go with this. Go ahead.
I want to jump in here today. Kind of our scaling capabilities are fairly limited, and we really rely on some of our other partners. So certainly VMware and Citrix do a great job to do more on a lot of different things between protocols and other things, but they also do scaling. We have some other partners that really just focus on that scaling aspect. So by that, what I mean is, if normally I want to have at peak capacity, I want 500 VMs ready to go and always going for all those people. But at 6 p.m. I want those to really taper off, right? There can be a lot more sense and respond by leveraging some of our partners to be able to get that done. Today, what we can do between the breadth and depth, and then being able to shut off by schedule, we can do some of that. But sometimes I encourage folks to look at some of the partners to be able to take that a little bit further.
That's a great point. So I had a customer who was spending, they were doing our traditional scaling, and they were having some struggles. And I think they were spending a good, 6-digit number on their Azure spend, right, every month. And they were kind of came to me and they said, Azim, this is really killing us. Our budget, we're not getting the margin that we were expecting, right? They're using these VDIs to make money. And so they weren't really getting the margin they were expecting. And so I brought in a partner called Nerdio, who has a much more sophisticated means of scaling. And for the $5,000 investment they made in Nerdio, they were to take that 6-digit number into a 5-digit number. So they immediately saw realized savings. And I'm not talking like, they saved $2,000 or $3,000, they saved a 6-digit number. So, I mean, the savings were very significant and realized immediately. It paid for itself. So we do rely heavily on our partners for some of that stuff. If you're looking for like user profile management, there's a partner called Liquidware. Happy to introduce you to my friends. I have a friend who works at Liquidware up in Chicagoland. So I get around in the Microsoft world a little bit, but to continue our host build, you can pick the number of VMs. So this is where things get interesting because you're going to need to calculate how much your real users are really going to need, right? And so we've got some calculators and experience estimators out there, but really it comes down to you knowing your users, right? So if you're dealing with developers or people with a heavy workload, you'll want to think about how many users and how much density you can really tolerate before they're going to start experiencing issues and start calling you, right? Our goal is to not make it so that users call you more. We want the users to call you less, right? Our goal is to make you the cool IT guy or girl, right? So that your users love you and say, you know what, these IT people are so awesome, I never have to deal with them. Because that's really how the users think, right? The less they deal with us IT folk, the happier they are. Trust me, I know from experience. My wife is one of those users. So so I'm going to go ahead and just choose one VM here because, I'm being cheap, right? And so that B2S VM, right? If you look at the cost for it, it's actually pretty inexpensive. I'm only going to spend about $30 a month for it, right? And we have VMs as cheap as $7. I don't recommend the B1S. It's a little too small to run Windows. It's great for Linux, but ultimately, I wouldn't recommend it. So the two CPU, 4 gig of RAM is just enough to really run this instance. And then the name prefix for your session host. So these are going to be the names of the machine. So you can't go too far long before it complains, right? The longest value is going to be 11 characters, and that's because the machine joins your domain. And when it does, it appends dash number. So if you're provisioning 100 VMs, it's going to start appending, numbers to that. And so we want to make sure that we come with something that is unique to your domain. I'm going to call it trash WVD because I'm going to throw it in the trash when I'm done, and I want to remember to do that. And then, essentially what we're going to do is we're going to create these VMs, and when it joins the domain, it can't have any conflicts and things like that. So we want to make sure it's sort of unique. That way we don't run into any issues. For image type, we can grab a custom image, right? So a lot of my customers want to take a Windows 10 multi-session image and recreate it and put their own bits on there, maybe install some software, and then, stamp that out for future images. That's a very common case. I don't have any that I'm going to use today. I almost always use the gallery image, and we have a bunch of gallery images that are very useful. I have a bunch of other customers that are more interested in using the gallery image and then layering their automation on top to set up the machine how they want. So they'll use group policies, and I'll talk about a little bit how to scope these VDIs with group policy. They use SCCM. I personally use Intune most of the time, so I've put a lot of work in my Intune environment to sort of leverage automation to make these VDIs do their thing. But Intune does take a little bit of time to do what it needs to do. So we're going to go ahead and pick this Windows 10 multi-session with Office 365 because, there's no point in running Windows without Office, in my opinion, because I need Office. I'm one of those people who likes to be very productive. And then I'm going to go ahead and choose. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, Azim, I think one of the great things for customers, what I hear again is I want to use my custom image, but the reality is nobody has a custom Win 10 multi-user image ready today.
Yeah.
So most of my customers start off, and I think we find that probably 95% of the images that are used for pilots and production today is exactly based on that image. So you can start with that and go ahead and take the one that already has Office in it, and you can start to customize from that one. Right.
Bingo.
And that'll be the base. And that it's optimized. That it's optimized not only just, to be optimized for Office, but also for VDI and Office in conjunction with VDI. So it's a great base image to start with. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what I'll do is I usually won't use my host pool as my image source. I like to create its own VM because when we inject our agent to connect, the sysprep doesn't like that agent. And so it's very common that you're better off kind of leveraging a VM on its own and creating a Windows 10 multi-session, which is available. You can do that on your own without using WVD. It has to run in Azure. That's the key. Windows won't activate if you don't. And so that's an important thing. So in terms of the disk, the reason why I'm choosing a premium SSD is because I'm a very impatient individual. I like to go fast, right? Ricky Bobby, I'm going fast. So that's one thing. But the other thing that I like to bring up that's important for customers to know is when you have a VM where only premium SSDs are attached, you get 3 nines of an SLA. It's the only scenario where a single VM can have some kind of SLA in Azure, and running a single VM with a premium disk is always going to be cheaper. Well, not always, almost always going to be cheaper than running multiple VMs in an availability set. The only time it might be more expensive is if you have some really large disks that you're attaching to that VM. Then you might start getting into the economics of, well, does it make more sense to do standard, HDDs in an availability set? But almost always especially in my lab and most of the customers I encounter, attaching a premium SSD to only premium SSDs to a VM will ensure that it stays up 99.9% of the time, which means it can only really be down for about 8 hours a year. And it's a financially backed SLA. So I like to point that out because it's important. If you expect your VM to be up and you just want to run a single VM, or you're running an application that's maybe not stateless, I always just kind of stick those premium SSDs on there because you get that SLA. So this is where things get really important. So I want to make sure I'm landing this VM in a virtual network, in a subnet that can talk to my domain controllers. You don't want to attach a public IP unless you have some reason to, but from a security perspective, I absolutely am not going to put a public IP on this. You don't need to, right? Microsoft handles the public access to these VDIs, and I'm also not going to open up any public ports. Don't need to. This is where things get interesting. So if your user principal name, right, in my case, my user principal name is Azim@manjee.me, right? And I'll go ahead and put in my password here. But the problem is my domain, oh yeah, you know what? I'm going to use my VM joiner account. Azim.network. Forgot about that. You need to, so your VM joiner account must have a 12 character password because if your VM join fails, it looks like it doesn't like my password. If your VM join fails, you will invariably have to log into that VM. I can't type today. Okay, that time I definitely got it wrong. Okay, there. Okay. What happens is the VM's local account will match this username and password. Okay, there we go. So in my network, yeah, that was a struggle there. Demo gods are really hating me today. In my network, my domain is Azim.network. But if your UPN suffix doesn't match your domain, you'll want to specify domain or OU. So in my case, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning today. Today, WVD requires. It's kind of a little bit confusing because you'll see a requirement for Azure AD and you'll see a requirement for Active Directory as well, regular Active Directory. The reality is your users are part of Azure Active Directory and your VMs are going to be part of traditional Active Directory, whether that's Active Directory domain services or whether that's going to be one that's replicated from your on-prem environment up to the cloud. It doesn't matter. But long term, we feel we'll see WVD where the machines can be Azure AD joined as well as the users. So today you still have to do both.
Yeah, so in this environment, my UPN suffix matches, but I also have Azure AD domain services. So I could theoretically also go to, my Azure AD domain services has a different name. So I could do azure.azim.network and actually join that environment as well. I'm not going to today though. And but from that perspective, I can also specify an OU. So why might you want to specify an OU? Right? Maybe you've got specific group policies that you want to use to sort of address certain needs, right? So like in my environment, I actually have a specific WVD GPO where I push my FSLogix configuration, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But I'm actually using a WMI scope also to focus on my Windows Virtual Desktop. So the SKU for Windows Virtual Multi-Session is Windows 10 Enterprise for virtual desktops. So I can actually use a WMI query to sort of sniper rifle those instances without affecting my regular Windows 10 users and stuff like that, because I don't want to do FSLogix on my desktops machines and stuff like that. Like I kind of want those things to be, local. So this is my way of attaching group policies to machines in my whole forest. But if you want, you can also use an OU, which is the traditional way to do it. And you may do a combination of both, but I like to point that out just because it can be handy for some users. So the next step is going to be, after we've sort of done all of these, we're going to go ahead and go to our workspace. And we can register to an app group. If you don't, then it just registers as a desktop host. But you can also say, hey, I want to register it to an app group because I want to deliver apps. In that environment, it'll actually find all the apps in your start menu for you to publish. So it's super easy. And I've helped customers do some crazy hacks. So for instance, I did this hack to push out Windows Subsystem for Linux, which is not something that can be done by default, but I was able to kind of trick it by creating some shortcuts and throwing them in my start menu. Same thing with like ADUC. ADUC is another one of those because I use WVD for secure access to like my management plane of my Active Directory. And so I had to do some trickery around that, but any shortcut you can sort of do that. I even pushed the WVD client to the WVD client. I know that's kind of silly. Why would you do that, right? But it was just kind of like inception, you know? I just felt like, why not? I had to. So we're going to go ahead and hit no here, and then we can get into tags. And so if you're doing any kind of tagging in your environment and you need to do like cost center or something like that, you know, I'll go ahead and just do env, right? My environment tag, and then I'll call it non-prod just because I like to, you know, I mean, everything is really non-prod, but once that's done, we're going to do a little validation. So anytime you deploy something in ARM, right, the Azure Resource Management API, it's going to do a pre-flight check to make sure it meets muster, right? In some cases, if you have Azure policies that are going to, you know, that might block you from using a storage account of this type or a VM of that size, those are going to land in our pre-flight check as well, typically. We can also download the template, which is a JSON file for us to automate the rebuild of this. So if I wanted to, I could actually rebuild this, you know, because everything is sort of defined as code. It's super handy. I'll you know, skip a lot of the Azure 101 stuff, but if anyone's interested in some of that Azure 101 stuff, reach out to John and maybe we can do a session on that if the folks are interested. So we're going to go ahead and hit the create button. And this is going to push my JSON template to the Azure Resource Management API, and it's going to start baking my image. Now, one thing that's worth mentioning in here is that when the image starts baking, it's only going to show us the very top level ARM template. Inside this ARM template, there's actually a nested ARM template. So there's a sub template in here to deploy the machines themselves. And so once this starts kicking off, we'll start seeing everything. You'll see this VM creation linked template. So I'm going to go ahead and open that up in a new tab and see if it'll let me open it up in a new tab. It might, otherwise I can just drill right into it. But we'll see the actual creation of the VM in its own. So there's a sub template that's actually going to deploy the VDI environment as a part of this main top level template. So now you can see we've deployed our NSG, the network interface, right? No machine in Azure can live without a network interface, right? What would be the point of that anyways? And now the virtual machine is deploying. After that, the domain join will occur, and that is where you're going to find 90% of your failures. Chances are, if it failed, it means you either fat fingered the password, DNS is not responding the way you would expect, or something is, you know, the other one that I see most common is the machine's name is already taken in the domain. And we'll go ahead and watch this bake and maybe open it up if anyone has any questions or anything like that. You know, feel free to unmute yourself and we can kind of answer any questions while we watch this cake bake, if you will. Otherwise, I can show you my dog. He's sleeping in the dog bed now over here. And I'll switch it to the dog cam. Why not?
Because you can.
Yeah, just having a little bit of fun. And it's a live feed. I know he's very still, but Liney. There we go.
He is moving.
He is moving. He is alive. Yeah. The other one is over here too, but he doesn't like being picked up, so I'm not gonna pick him up. He's the kind of dog, he might actually bite you if you pick him up. Schnauzers aren't really into being picked up. But yeah, if anyone has any questions, you know, I'm gonna go ahead and look at real quick at the attendee list. I see Eric Boggs joined. Hey Eric. Oh, Ram, go ahead and unmute yourself. We can answer your question.
Hey, Azim, thanks for this. Quick question. So if I want to install a line of business application, how easy is it? Like, you know, can I
Sure.
do any application or like, are the requirements?
Yeah, I mean, if it's a Windows like 32-bit or 64-bit application, what I would do is either make it part of my image, or if I just have one host, go ahead and install it on the host. And then I'll go ahead and switch gears here and kind of take you into that. So while we're waiting for that to bake, I will show you what that looks like. That's a great question. You know, how can you be a hero if you can't do this application group part? And if we don't demonstrate it, you know, maybe we're not doing a good enough job. So that's a good point. So I'm going to go ahead and go into my application group here and show you what this looks like. So on my VMs, it actually looks for, where is it? Sorry, I'm kind of flubbing here. Application group. There we go. So in my application group, that's odd. Why is that grayed out? Demo gods are annoyed with me. Could have sworn I just deployed some applications today, so I'm very confused as to why I'm not. Oh, I'm in the wrong tenant. That's why.
And I think to Ram's question, I think partly it's can I update my base image, right? So in my host pool, I could install a new application into the base image, right? So if I wanted to put Adobe Reader into the base image, I could do that and then republish it out. If they're personal images, then I'm going to use something like, maybe I'm going to use System Center to be able to push those applications, or Intune to push those applications out to those individual personal desktops, right? But
Yep.
then once they're on there, then Azim, what he's going to show you is can be that he can deliver those separately.
How to actually publish them. So I went into the WVD environment. I went to application groups. I kind of rewound it just because the reason why I couldn't find it earlier is because I was in my Microsoft tenant, and I don't really have much of that going on in the Microsoft tenant. I use my own tenant. So in there, you drill into the application group, and then in here you can find applications. So I've already exposed a couple of ones. So I've got like Internet Explorer here that actually takes me to SharePoint, and I actually called it ScarePoint. And so I put in the command line to take me to like Microsoft SharePoint. And then I actually have another one that a customer hit me with today. This is a good one. He needed to open a UNC path, and that wasn't really working in the command line argument. So I actually had to create a .cmd file to open up that Explorer with the UNC path to deliver that for him in a sort of a SaaS model. But in here, I just hit the add button, and it'll bring up, and I can pull up, I can draw out a direct file path. So if the application is just some exe that exists somewhere in the file system, you can call that out specifically. Or if it created a start menu item, you can also parse. It'll actually scan the start menu of the host in your application group. So one of the key prerequisites here is the host needs to be in an application group, which isn't really that hard. You can kind of do that as part of your deployment, but it'll actually show you all the different applications that are installed. So for instance, 7-Zip isn't installed on the image by default, and I use the base Microsoft gallery image, but because I have Intune, being and because I have these machines being forced to enroll into Intune via group policy, 7-Zip, VLC, Steam, a bunch of fun applications that I need on all my machines deploy. So like Firefox, for instance, I'll go ahead and deploy Firefox here. So Firefox created a shortcut, so I can actually say Firefox. And then I used to have this old coworker of mine who used to call it Foxfire, which I thought was really funny. He was just an elderly gentleman, and this was when Firefox was new, and so he was like, "Damn hippie kids and their Foxfire, use Internet Explorer." He was just kind of a funny guy, so I always joke about him calling it Foxfire. He's long gone these days, but I do miss his funny antics. And so go ahead and deploy it. It'll actually grab the icon from the application as well, so I don't have to worry about icons. But if your app has a custom icon or something, you can create a custom shortcut in the OS, put whatever icon you want on there, add whatever command line parameter or arguments you want, and then put that shortcut somewhere in the start menu, and it'll actually find it, and then you can publish it from here. So now that this is here, if I go over to my WVD FAT client, for instance, we should have it show up down here if I hit the refresh button. So it's pretty instant. Am I answering your question, Rom? Did I do it too fast, or?
Yeah. This is one. I mean, for the application that is already installed, but let's say Visual Studio right there. Let's say, right, got an exe downloaded, and how do I get into this WVD?
Sure. So that's a great question. So in my environment, that host lives as a VM in my network, right? Since I can domain join it. Otherwise, I can connect to the VM, via, RDP. I can stick a public IP on that VM and RDP into it. And then from there, I'm in the VM. I can just go ahead and install it like I would with any Windows app, right? So I could go in and grab Visual Studio Code and install it. In some cases, certain applications, when you want to install them in a VDI environment, they ask that you turn on this VDI mode, or they may have specific requirements. So depending on the application, you may want to like do some searching on the internet just to make sure like that application is friendly with VDI, or if there's any extra steps you might need to take. Like Teams, for instance, I typically do the machine-wide installer, whereas for some other applications, they do like to install on a per user basis. And so it can be kind of handy to know that ahead of time. So if it's Visual Studio Code, for instance, I didn't have any issue. I just installed it for all users on my machine, and then I published it, and it was happy.
Got it. Thanks, Azim.
Yep, no problem. I hope I answered the question you're asking.
Azim, it looked like your dog just walked across your head.
Yeah, I think he heard treats being distributed, and so he decided to go take a little walk.
And one thing to Ram's question, one thing further, we've done recently, we've added something called Image Gallery and Image Builder, to where we've made it a little bit easier to be able to manage that image. So if especially I've got a distributed architecture where I've got people that are in India, I've got people that are in the UK, and I got people that are in East and West US, I can, through Image Gallery and image management, I can send that base image to all 4 of those locations. I think I said 4, all at the same time, and it'll keep track of the different versions as well. So when I do an update and I'm updating in my host pools, it's a lot easier. So I do an upgrade where I'm putting Visual Studio, for example, into that base image, and then say, great, send it to all 4 of my my regions that I'm working with. So we've done a lot to try and simplify that.
Yeah, and so that's a great point that I like to bring up to a lot of my users, right? Or a lot of my customers, right? You might have a user in India and a user in the United States. You don't necessarily want to send them to the same host pool, right? So if I have a user who's in India, right, and this is my very crude drawing of the United States and India that I just did.
Oh, that's high tech there.
Yeah, it's pretty bad, I know. And so, from my perspective, if I have a user who's in India, I want their VM to be in India, right? I want them to be as close to that VM as they can. And the same thing for the user, right? I would want him or her to be close to that instance so that their experience is good. If I have a user in India who's got to connect to the US VM, he or she is going to have a terrible experience. And we don't want the users to have a bad experience, because if clicking on something feels slow because of latency of moving across the world, they're going to say the whole thing is slow, right? They're going to complain that everything is slow, that the app is slow. So you might get misnomer, user responses because their VDI experience is actually bad and they're having to do some hairpinning or something like that. Sort of the same thing with DNS, right? If my domain controller is on-prem and my DNS is all on-prem and my VDI lives in Azure, every time I go to Google or I do a DNS lookup, that VDI has got to go to on-prem to make that request, and that adds a cost latency-wise to every single request that exists. So you always want to have that kind of local egress perspective and keeping things sort of local to the user. So, by the way, my domain join was successful, and now the DSC extension, this is the part where the VM, it injects the application to connect that VDI instance to our, what I refer to as the Azure substrate or the WVD substrate. Oh, it just completed. Okay. So that part successfully happened. So now if you go to the resource group, you'll actually see this is just a VM in Azure. That's all it really is. I mean, if I wanted, I could actually go and RDP to this thing without any of the fancy WVD front door stuff, right? It's got a 192.168 IP address. If I go to MSTSC on my machine, I can actually pop that IP address in, right? And it'll actually respond and prompt me to sign in, right? And this is my WVD instance. I'm not going to do it here, though. What I'm going to do is go here, and I am going to go to all resources and refresh this page. Actually, this is the old client, so I need to actually go to the new client, because the ARM, there, and if any of you are old school WVD people, right, which means you started this in the fall of last year, there's 2 portals now. So there's the ARM portal, which is the new way of doing it. We don't really want you to do it in what we call the classic way, and so that portal I showed you is all the classic VDIs. They're eventually going to allow you to migrate everything over if you did create your VDIs in the old way. But if you came here looking for answers around that, this is probably not. That's probably more on the hero side, not so much on the zero side. But we're happy to help kind of answer some of those questions. So Session Desktop is my new Trash Me machine, and just to kind of put the proof in the pudding, I'll go ahead and sign in and do like a host name command so you can see that this is the new machine and this isn't some BS can demo that I put together. After that, I mean, agenda-wise, the only thing else we have to really talk about is maybe FS Logics or the backend storage options, right? So if you're redirecting your user profiles, you're going to want some kind of backend storage. I am very much biased towards Azure NetApp Files because I believe it is more secure and easier to set up than Azure Files. I know people are like, wait a second. The guy from Microsoft is telling me to use someone else's thing over the Microsoft thing? Yeah, you're damn right I am. Because in reality, NetApp Files is a first-party service in Azure. So if you buy Azure NetApp Files, chances are you're you're already you go to, if you need support on it or anything like that, you're going to be going to Microsoft for that support. All right, go whammy. Oh, this is not the host. That's a WVD2. I guess I didn't. Maybe I refreshed this too quickly. It might take a minute for the host pool to show up in that instance.
I think one of the things that's interesting here, as comparison to if I were to do a straight RDP to that VM, one of the things that we've instituted with WVD is something called reverse connect. So all of my connections to my VMs, they're actually proxied and requests are made on behalf of me. So I'm not actually opening up any connections straight to the VM, right?
I actually
jumped
the gun here.
Becomes important.
Yeah, so I
Yeah,
jumped the gun here. I didn't assign myself to the VM. So how am I supposed to see that
yeah.
VM? Right? You got to assign users to entitlements. So that's the other thing you care about, those VMs, but also who gets to get into them. So if I go into my application group, there's this assignment section. So I can add users. Now, one thing that catches users all the time is they always say, hey, but I see my guest users in here, right? If I pull up, Lukeman, right? Lukeman is a teammate of mine. He's got a Microsoft account, but this isn't my Microsoft tenant, right? So you might be able to add Lukeman or any other guest user to your environment, but they're not going to be able to sign into the host pool. So just to kind of stop you right there, because it comes up all the time, guest accounts cannot access WVDs yet. It is one of the most asked for things, but it is not there today, and I have no ETA for you, unfortunately. So one of the things that a lot of people ask me is like, well, you work at Microsoft. Do you get any kind of insider info from Washington? And I'll tell you right now, they care less about me than they do. Like they care more about the customer than they do about me. So I find out almost half the time after my customers. My customers will text me and say, hey, I saw you guys renamed Common Data Service to Dataflex. And that's usually the first time I'm finding out about that type of thing. So now that I've got an entitlement to my VM, right, now I can actually pull this up. So I didn't mean to cut you off, Rob. I just wanted to correct myself because I did skip a step.
No, that's okay. And when you're building out that host pool, you get a quick option to be able to put in who you want to assign, just the desktop assignment, not necessarily individual applications. So you can do it in one step, but almost never does anybody do it in one step. They go back in and add the assignments later.
Yeah. I'm going to go ahead and do a control F5 here because it hasn't quite shown up for me yet. That's where entitlements can sometimes take a minute. Make sure I didn't skip any steps here, but we should see those show up under the Trash Me desktop application group now that that's been assigned.
I think while that's coming up, if anybody has any other.
Yeah, feel free to pepper us with questions, and I'm happy to stay after the hour is over to answer any questions as well. We did go very fast, so I don't expect you to have any of this memorized. Luckily, John agreed to record it, and I had a few people request that we record it so that they could watch it later at 2x, so they could go even faster, right? Because everybody's like Ricky Bobby these days. They want to go fast, and so we want to make sure everyone's set up for success here.
And really the only thing to get where Azim started, I had to have my AD replicated in there, or as Azim mentioned, I could start with, say, ADDS and put in a fake directory service account. Really, once I have that and I have my subscription, you're ready to kind of go forth and kind of present what really Azim's gone through and put up in a matter of minutes.
Yeah, I'm not sure why it hasn't quite shown up yet. Maybe I'm being a little impatient. Make sure my entitlements are okay. Demo gods may be annoyed with me a little bit. And in terms of Teams voice and video, that's another thing I wanted to bring up as well while I sort of wait for my entitlements to show up. Maybe I need to assign. No, I shouldn't need to assign the VM in a multi-user environment. It should just show me that VM. It could be that the VM hasn't fully registered with the service. That's another common one. that I've seen, where sometimes there's a little bit of delay there, and it may not make it into the demo, but I hope it does, because that was the point.
I think that's a good point. Like where you said the Teams as a certain application that represents a whole lot more, right?
Mm-hmm.
When we say that it represents a whole lot more, something that we did with relative to WVD is we took native RDP and we went back to like version 7 to start re-architecting the protocol from RDP version 7 so that we could go pre-UDP days and kind of re-architect it. One of the things we needed to get into the product was that reverse connect mentality and understanding Azure. So it's not your traditional RDP that you find out in the wild. It's a slightly different version of RDP that we call the side-by-side protocol because it's running kind of beside RDP. We're starting to drop in some of those UDP capabilities, and one of those includes the ability to redirect audio-video traffic, and specific to Teams, which is probably the #1 most requested improvement, is to be able to make my Teams traffic in WVD work better. So what it does is, rather than the Teams traffic for AV, like what we're having today, instead of going up into the virtual machine and then across to the team servers and then down to the tenant, instead it stays at the local client. It kind of redirects it down to the local client, and everything's done out of band of the WVD environment, so it can really give you that near local experience, right? Because really your local device is making that connection. Now, in that case today, it requires a Win10 at the endpoint that you're connecting from. But in the future, since we built it into kind of a compartmentalized piece, that should rapidly be able to move over to Linux and Mac and other devices as well. In addition to other redirection technologies where I can bring YouTube videos and let the local device render rather than it being able to or having to render in the VDI session.
Yeah, and so to get Teams kind of set up, there's just a registry key you need to flip, and that is just it's a Teams registry key that says is VDI, is 0 or 1. It's, I think, a D word, and as long as you set it to 1, Teams is aware now that it's in a VDI environment. And then for the FAT client, you basically need to make sure you're redirecting your USB devices, so you can redirect microphone as well, and then the camera, and then you can basically do VDI Teams where you're sort of sending that VDI feed into the Teams environment. Now, all the processing for the video and all of that happens sort of locally, and so it does it does look like it's happening in Azure, but I think some of that processing does happen locally, so you do need to meet some of the Teams minimum requirements on your machine itself.
And I think one of the things I want to mention, where you're showing like the FAT client for Windows, what's awesome is that those icons can be sent straight to the desktop or straight to your program groups, right? So where I don't even have to access it through that. And I think that's probably.
Sorry. Looks like we've got an open question from Michael.
Oh, hey, yep. Yeah, and this is an example of a OneNote instance.
One of the major issues is, I think one of our I work for the government,
sure.
Local government. So one of our major issues is that a lot of our data has to be stored on premises right now because there's no like Atlanta-based cloud option. Do you guys does Azure plan, or are they going to have like locations that are specific in Atlanta for very sensitive data, or is that going to be part of VDI? Because I know you guys are going into healthcare and doing some of those more healthcare options for healthcare providers, but I wasn't sure if you had thought outside that scope.
So I don't think there's any plans for a data center in Atlanta, but you can always do express route to have low latency connectivity with your on-premise environment. So I can, for instance, go to azimstack.azim.network, right, and tunnel through my VPN into my on-premise environment. And so I could sort of maybe meet those regulatory or contractual obligations. Go ahead, Rob, if there's other thoughts you were having.
No, I think that's spot on, that you can force tunnel everything to go back to your on-prem data center. Additionally, we are coming live with Azure GovCloud very soon. It won't be Atlanta based, but it will be in the Azure Gov tenant to where if you need it to be isolated, it could be there.
Yeah. Is there a data residency legal requirement, or is that more of a
It's
contractual
called
obligation?
the Sixth Amendment to the Constitution.
Ah, okay. So something specific to
So
Atlanta.
it's literally anything that has to do with social security numbers or people's birth dates or anything like that has to be physically located, and it has to be within, I think it's either 100 to 50 miles.
Okay.
Yeah, so you'd have to do that, I guess, with force tunneling back to your.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's probably how I would approach it. So another thing I might do is institute some kind of DLP or AIP mechanism to make sure I'm inspecting that data is not leaving that environment, right? If you've got a regulatory need to requirement you need to meet, I would probably be putting some control mechanisms in place to ensure that no one's pulling data out of that data center, which there's a million different ways to inspect that traffic and facilitate that. But yeah, and unfortunately, I wish we had a local Atlanta data center that we could use for Azure. I know I would be down for that because I would definitely be pointing. But from a latency perspective, East is pretty good. But I understand why you have that need. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And I know, like Citrix, for example, as one of our partners, they have the ability that it will identify that, hey, that's a social security. Yes, you're allowed to send email, but you can't send a social security number via email and it'll exit out. So it can work right inside the session if you want, or you can leverage like one of our other partners like Palo, where Palo can say, hey, you're not allowed to send this, type of port, data. And it can base it on user learning, where it learns what it is that user typically does and what ports they're allowed to be able to access. So depending on whether you need to be inside the session or outside the session from a scanning perspective, but slightly different from the radius requirement that you mentioned.
Okay, thank you.
And I'm thankful for one as a state of Georgia resident that you're doing that.
Yeah. Although I will say Microsoft probably is better at maybe securing stuff than just about anyone else these days when it comes to running a data center. It is sort of our core business now, but I understand that need. Are there any other questions out there in the field? It seems like my host pool hasn't shown up yet. I'm not sure what the deal is. Could be just some delays. What my old friend refers to as cloud time. Sometimes things replicate.
See a hand up from Michael L. Unless that
I
was
think
a question.
I think that was a question he was just asking. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot to lower my hand.
Yep.
Yeah, no worries.
I do the same thing.
Yep, me too.
Yeah, I guess we'll have to use our imagination. I don't want to keep everyone here while they wait for this host pool to sort of deploy. It kind of looks like it's decided to take its time today.
I'll tell you one of the questions that I get a lot, Azim, is great. So you have this multi-user image, but I have different users that are wanting to connect, and I need to have kind of a personalized environment, even though I'm going to use this multi-user environment. How do I do that?
Yeah, so you have different users who want to connect to the environment. So I mean, from my perspective, I would just be piling those users into different app groups or host pools, right, depending on what their entitlements are. And then from that perspective, should be good to go. I think typically I want to make sure my users aren't colliding and things like that. So I might segregate them a little bit based on their geography or their use case. So in some cases, users may need different suites of applications. And so, it all depends on what I would refer to as the user story. Am I answering your question, Rob?
Well, I was thinking, you went a lot broader than I was thinking. I was thinking more of just their user customizations, their favorites, and their, connect their documents into the session.
Oh yeah, so from that perspective, that's where that FS Logics product comes in, and I think I did have that as a thing to talk about. So for those backend storages, FS Logics does this really cool thing where it will redirect the entire user profile to a Samba share, and I'll show you what this looks like. So I've got my NetApp Samba share where my user profile lives, and I can actually connect to this on port 445 through my own private network, because it's not like Azure Files where it goes through the public WAN. AT&T blocks that kind of traffic. I'm taking a private path because Azure NetApp Files takes a private IP in the virtual network. So I can route to it through a private VPN. And then from here, I've got my user profile, which lives in a VHD. And so what happens is when I log into my VDI, that VHD mounts to the host and presents my user profile from within. All the stuff I do as a user lives in that VHD. And then when I sign out, it disconnects. And then when I log into another VM, right, because I might not land in the same VM when I sign back in, unless I only have one VM, that user profile will then again mount to the machine and present itself. So from the user perspective, they just, it looks like it logged into the same machine for them. They didn't notice anything different. For them, it's just always the same. So it's kind of slick from that perspective. And that's something we acquired to deliver, a better user experience.
Yeah, awesome. And I came into Microsoft through that acquisition, so love hearing you talk about it.
I didn't know that. Okay, hey, yeah, I was
exactly.
actually super pumped by that acquisition when I first heard about Windows Virtual Desktop at Ignite of I think 2018. I just kept bothering people like, when is this coming out? When can I get my hands on FSLogix? This was before I was an employee of Microsoft. I didn't join Microsoft until 2019, and I was
right?
kind of annoying. I was one of the most annoying customers because I'm okay with being annoying. I'm the youngest in my family, so being annoying just kind of comes with that. And so I was always sort of emailing and annoying people about when this product was coming out. I finally got to get my hands on it in fall of 2019 when everyone else did, because as a Microsoft employee, they pretty much treat me just like everyone else. I don't get any early access or anything like that.
I think what's great for folks that are working towards a cloud transformation is that you can leverage you can leverage FSLogix in your on-premises environment. For the most part, it's the same entitlements that get you WVD also get you access to FSLogix, and actually it's a little bit broader as well. But if you're doing session host in your on-prem or VDI in your on-premises environment, then more than likely you already have access to FSLogix, so you can start containerizing those profiles in your journey to cloud and be able to then port those user containers over to WVD. And actually, since we mentioned government, we're seeing government has done this a lot. The Fed space, they really were very quick to adopt FSLogix, and they're starting to bring some of that over to Azure, especially now that WVD is starting to go to Azure Gov.
I'm not entirely sure why I still don't see my host pool in here, but we'll have to just use our imagination. Of course, no demo is complete without some kind of blue screen equivalent, unless I'm missing something here. But I do this pretty much every day, so I have missed stuff in the past, so I can't pretend like I'm not gonna make this in the most imperfect session. But yeah, outside of that, if there aren't any other questions, we can go ahead and I'll put in my I'll let you all sort of screen cap this, and I'll also put in my LinkedIn for those of you who maybe aren't aren't connected with me. It's just aka.ms/Azure Azim. That's my sort of LinkedIn direct redirect for the AKMS. Because I'm a Microsoft employee, I can make all the AKMS links that I want. I actually made these top two ones because I got so sick of having to search for them in Google that I just wanted to make direct links to them.
I knew I had never seen those before, those first two.
Yeah, it's because I made them last week because I'm purely for my own selfish needs of being lazy. I was like, I'm too lazy to have to find this every time. Let me just make some links real quick.
Nice. I think one of the things I would mention also, should you guys have questions, anybody who wants more information beyond this and beyond those links, I suppose through John, you can reach out to Azim and myself. We're happy to help guide you down that path.
Yeah, it's our job to make customers successful. Typically, we focus on the enterprise commercial space, but I'm not afraid to talk to any customer. I'm just like you all. I'm from IT, right? I used to work help desk. My first job was below the help desk. I was the administrative assistant to the help desk in my first job, so I've seen it all.
That's awesome.
Okay. Well, thank you all. Let me go ahead and stop the recording at this point. And